So this morning is a bit of a one-off sermon, and I hope it's going to be helpful. And I said this to the earlier service, and I probably shouldn't have, but here we go again. I speak most every week, and I have for the last, probably 2 decades or so. And so at some point, it's kind of like, the worst thing someone can say if they invite me, hey, we want you to speak at our church or at our camp or at our youth group, and I say, okay, what do you want me to talk about? They're like, well, whatever God's put on your heart. And I'm like, He has had to put something on my heart every single week for the last 2 decades, right? Like it's not like, oh man, I just have this wealth of creativity. I'm like, I've been wanting to say something but haven't had the outlet. I'm like, no matter what happens every single week, I have a research paper and an oral presentation due to hundreds of people. And so the idea of just like, hey, what do you want to talk about this week can be difficult. And so this week, earlier on, we were thinking, okay, what do I want to talk about? What do I want to preach about? And so I was like, you know what? God, you speak through other people. So I just went into Google, did a very holy search and said, best sermon ever, right? And let me just tell you, this is not going to be that, okay? So if you're like, oh my gosh, he's building this up. But I heard this guy named Tim Keller, who some of you may or may not have heard of. And Tim Keller is just the GOAT, as in the greatest of all times of pastors and preachers. And he just has such a great way of creating simplicity and palatability out of the complexity of a sophisticated wealth of theological and biblical knowledge. And all that to say is he said something, and he started to go over some verses. And you've probably been there where you don't really remember what the pastor said. Well, that's probably every Sunday, right? But it wasn't necessarily what he said. It was that what he said caused a train reaction of thought inside of you. And so today, I just want to walk you through my ADHD train reaction of thought that I was listening to Tim Keller talk about the book of Exodus. And I thought it was so helpful because I started to peel back some layers of a story or a sequence of events that we're going to read about. And my hope is that today, for many of us, we have been walking through life, and for whatever reason, we know the call that God has placed on our life. We know the step of faith that God has called us to take. We know the action that he's called us to, yet we are hesitant to do it. And that's not necessarily new or uncommon in terms of just acknowledging and identifying that reality exists and that tendency and that pattern exists just within the Christian life. But I want to talk for a little bit today about why that is. And we're going to look through the book of Exodus. And if you've never read the Bible and aren't terribly familiar with the book of Exodus, it's in the Old Testament. It's one of the first books we come into. It's Genesis and then Exodus. And the idea leading up to this point, which is important, is that God had chosen a people. He started out with a family, and the family became a nation. Started out with Abraham. God said, I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to be your God. You are going to be my people. And he covenanted with Abraham. And so God was to be the personal God of the nation of Israel, or of the descendants of Abraham. And if you've ever been to Sunday school, you know the song, because Father Abraham had many sons and many sons had, and I am one of them, and so let's all. Y'all were so much more excited when Jordan was singing. That's all I'm going to say. I would appreciate. Anyways, so Israel was this nation. They were growing, and they kind of, continued to grow and to flourish. Well, eventually, a sequence of events happened that landed them in Egypt. And at first, they had great influence in Egypt, and they had, a great position, a person in a position of power. But over time, they forgot about the benefit the nation of Israel gave to the kingdom or the nation of Egypt, and they started to enslave the people of Israel. And throughout generations, from decade to decade, the oppression got worse and worse. The slavery got worse and worse. But the nation of Israel grew just exponentially in terms of numbers. So it goes from, some family members to, a few dozen, to a few hundred, to a few thousand, to some people believe up to a few million people in the nation of Israel that were enslaved in Egyptian slavery. And day after day, they would call out. Day after day, they would cry out, God, deliver us, God, free us. God, deliver us, God, free us. And so one day, God, he heard them the entire time, but acknowledges, and in his plan says, I have someone for you, and his name is Moses. Now, Moses was raised in Pharaoh's house. Moses witnessed some things that happened on the street one day, and Moses actually killed one of the Egyptians. He was from the nation of Israel, raised in the Egyptian house, in Egyptian royalty, killed an Egyptian, and out of fear ran. Spent 40 years in the desert, running, being afraid for his life. And God says, I want you to go back and I want you to deliver the nation of Israel. And I'm going to do some extraordinary things in this. In fact, 10 specific plagues are going to hit. And I want you to go to Pharaoh and say, Pharaoh, let my people go, and he's going to say no. And I want you to go and say, Pharaoh, let my people go, and he's going to say no. And every time he says no, I'm going to unleash a new plague. And so 10 plagues hit the nation. It was, plague of the Nile turned into blood. So none of the sea life and the fish, they all died. So they didn't have any much to eat and didn't have anything to drink. There was some locusts. There was some, fiery hail type of things that happened. And the last plague was the plague of death, that every single person was going to be subject to this judgment, that the judgment of God was going to come over the nation, was going to come over Egypt, and every firstborn male of every family and of every livestock was going to die. But you could avoid it if you sacrificed a lamb, put the blood of the lamb on the doorpost, and the blood of the lamb would save you from the judgment of God. Well, so that happens. And Pharaoh says, you can now go free. So the nation of Israel is now herding out of Egypt. They are going towards what we know now as the Red Sea. And as they're approaching the Red Sea, Pharaoh changes his mind and says, you know what? If we let all of those people go like we just decided, if we let all of those people go, then we are going to lose the totality of our economy, because our economy is built off of slave labor. And so we're going to send our armies to go retrieve the free slaves that we have just now sent out into the desert. Well, they have been wondering, and they have been hoping, and they have been praying, and finally they are now set free. So we come to a juxtaposition, kind of a contrast, where they're coming up to the water. They're coming up to the Red Sea, and all of a sudden they see Pharaoh's army. They see what is about to be impending doom and threat. And so they see it, and they have a response that actually turns into a cyclical response, which is what we're going to study. So starting at chapter 14, verse 10, it says this. And so when Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them. And they feared greatly, and the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. And their fear was a substantiated fear. Their fear was an existential fear. Their fear was, we have now left, they said we could go, and they are now going to find us, or we see them coming, they haven't just are going to find us, they have found us, and they're either going to kill us here, they're going to take us back into Egypt, and kill us there. And so they look to Moses, and they're saying, Moses, what in the heck, man? What in the heck is going on? This is their statement to Moses. Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? That's kind of a sarcastic way of saying, so Moses, what's the deal, man? Were there just not enough graves in Egypt? Like you're like, oh, there's not enough, so we're just going to all die in the desert. They say it explicitly in verse 12. Is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians, for it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. They're saying, Moses, didn't we tell you? Did we say this to you? Just leave us alone. It will be better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die out here. If I was Moses at about this point, I'd have been like, I don't know if you remember this, but that is the opposite of what you said. They're like, Moses, remember when we said this? And I'm like, and Moses is like, no, that is not at all what you said. In fact, you said the opposite. What you said was, deliver us, deliver us, deliver us, deliver us, deliver us. They prayed night and day, God, deliver us, deliver us, deliver us, deliver us. And when they saw Moses come into to town, when they saw and they heard what God had done, when they saw the miracles, they had the opposite. In fact, and flip back a couple chapters with me to chapter 4. This is what happens in verse 29. Then Moses and Aaron went and gathered together all the elders of the people of Israel, so kind of the community leaders. Aaron spoke all the words that the Lord had spoken to Moses and did the signs in the sight of the people, and the people believed. When they heard that the Lord had visited the people of Israel, that he had seen their afflictions, they bowed their heads and worshiped. Here's the contrast that I started to think about as I started to think about us. If you were to ask any of the nation of Israel, as they're in the desert, about their current state and their current condition, here's what they would say. We were enslaved. We have been set free. We're on our way to the promised land. We are not there yet. We are on the way to the promised land to which God has called us to, and in fact, the presence of the Lord was with them. We have been set free. We realized that we were enslaved. We realized that we were in bondage. We have been set free. We are on our way to the promised land. But we are not there yet. It's what theologians will call the already not yet. Because it's the same context we find ourselves in. If you follow Jesus, if you place your faith, your hope, your trust in Jesus, it's the same thing. By the blood of Jesus, that we know that we can't earn our way into God's good graces because none of us can unsin ourselves. In God's holiness, he can't have sin in and around himself. And so God knows that, God sees that, God did not expect us to moral our way into his good graces, but paid the price to forgive our sins. And by paid the price, I mean like anything else, if there is a separation, if I get caught speeding and I get pulled over and I get a speeding ticket, I have to pay that fine. We could not pay the fine to make us right with God and to get our basic learner's permit back. So God did that for us through Jesus. But many of us, like the nation of Israel, though we have been set free, we all already achieved in our salvation, yet we are not in the promised land yet, come to a Red Sea moment in our lives, and at those moments, we oftentimes look back with a longing for slavery. We wouldn't put it in that context, by the way. But we look back with a longing for slavery. And here's why. We would rather have the certainty of slavery than the uncertainty of faith and trust. We would rather the uncertainty or the certainty of slavery because they knew, hey, if we're going to stay there, they're at least going to keep us alive because they have to keep us alive because their economy depends on it. Now, they might not keep everybody alive, and Fair might decide, let's make an example of one or two folks, but by and large, if we are out here, we might all die, and we have certainty, we have existential, communal certainty as it relates to Egypt. But now we're out here. And Moses, you see them. You see this threat that we face. This is a repetitive cycle, by the way. Chapter 16. Starting at verse 2. And the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses. By the way, he delivered them in that part, in case you didn't know what happened in the rest of that part of the story. Grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the people of Israel said to them, would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt when we sat by meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us into the wilderness to kill the whole assembly with hunger. Moses, we got hundreds of thousands of people out here. And I don't know if you know, but deserts are not known for their abundance of food. So Moses, we know that God has called us to, we know the promised land, we know that what you said his promises, but Moses, it's starting to get a little bit hot, it's starting to be a little bit difficult, we're all hungry, and Moses, we long for the days of slavery when we sat around pots of meat. And isn't it interesting? Oftentimes, when you remember back as a Christian, when you have this kind of existential thought of your current life, of what it takes to live a life of faith versus what your life used to be, it's easy to look back with a positive slant towards what life used to be. Because it's certainty. They didn't love slavery. They thought, well, at least we had food to eat. Let me give us a little common application. Because when it comes to certainty of slavery versus the uncertainty of faith, practicality matters deeply. Here's an example. This might be for you. For some of you, you're in the realm of life right now where you are dating and looking for a future spouse. And somewhere along the way, perhaps you're in this context right now, but we have people after the first service that said, man, I'm so glad you said that because that was me. Perhaps your context right now is you are tempted to find someone, to find a partner, to find a potential life partner, and in your life partner, they don't know Jesus. And you know that the Bible says clearly, don't be unequally yoked with unbelievers. And it's that the imagery is like this ox and this yoke that goes over them. They're both pulling in the same direction. But if you're unequally yoked, then one's going to pull in a different direction. The other one's going to pull, and it's going to pull a little stronger, a little weaker. And so it's just not going to go and be effective and efficient towards the purpose it was made for. In other words, it's really difficult to parent with someone who doesn't have the same values. It's really difficult to parent and say, hey, trust in Jesus, when you're the person saying, nah, not for me. In fact, if we're just going to be real honest and real practical about this, This is why Ephesians 5 and a proper exegesis of that text matters so deeply. Because what Paul leads into that, if you're not familiar with that, that's the part that's notorious for the fact that it says, wives submit to husbands and husbands love your wives. It precedes that by saying, hey, you should submit to one another. You should submit to one another. And then it says, husbands, love your wife like Christ loved the church. Wives, submit to your husband. So here's functionally what that looks like. For my wife and I, there ought to be the sense of like everything I'm doing, I'm just saying, you're first. You're first. I'm going to submit to you. Like, I'm going to put you first, your wants first, your need first, your sanctification first. And she should be wanting to put mine first and say, hey, your wants first, your needs first, your sanctifications first. But if anybody is going to be the one who ultimately is the ultimate sacrificer, it is me as the husband. And for her submitting to me, what that simply means is when I'm sitting there at the restaurant and she's sitting there at the restaurant and I'm saying, no, you going first. She's saying, no, you going first. And I'm saying, no, you going first. And she's saying, no, you going first. And everybody's like, well, somebody freaking go first, right? When that happens, she says, fine, I will allow you to put me first. If you're not married to someone who knows Jesus, you are no less bound to that commandment. And that's difficult. But the tempting part is the certainty of companionship. The certainty of companionship, because you know that if you go in that direction, there are plenty of fish in the sea. But right, if I can just speak on behalf of the Christian ladies in the room, you're like, yo, is there a fish in the sea of Christian men? You're like, good grief. Like, we had this women's worship night. Like, dudes went camping. There's like 7 of them. Women's worship night. They're all like, we love Jesus, And you're like, come on. Like, where all that? By the way, guys, I'm telling you, you should love Jesus. Like, you're going to marry so far out of your league. Look at anybody on staff that's married, right? Like, I mean, it's just, it's absurd. Anyways, here's the thing. You would not think about that as slavery, but you have been set free from that. And the reality is it's so easy because it is so certain. And on this other side, you're looking at God and you're saying, God, I want to trust you in this area. I want to trust you in this area. But I also don't want to be alone. And I'm uncertain as to whether I will ever find a spouse that honors and loves Jesus and serves our family on either side. We like to talk about faith as if it's this answer to a question that we don't have an answer to. Why do you know that God's there? Well, you just got to have faith. How do you know Jesus? Well, you just got to have faith. There are good reasons behind our belief system. Faith is trusting God. Faith is trusting God when everything inside of us says return to slavery. It's that thing inside of you. It's the reason when we're talking about generosity, when we're talking about giving, it's the reason that most of us aren't actually generous. And hear me a couple qualifiers in this. Number one, our church is doing wonderful financially. So it's not like at the end of this sermon, we're going to be like, all right, we're going to pass the basket around one more time. It's COVID. We don't even pass baskets at this point, right? The other thing is, many of you know about me, I'm bivocational. My family owns and I run our family's company, registers, meat company, registers, sausage. You should buy all of it, okay? It's like tithing. It's just a little bit different. But the reality is, it's like my bills aren't going to get paid whether you give or not. But isn't this true? We know definitively, Jesus says the primary competitor for your heart is your money. The primary competitor for your heart is what you have in your wallet. And yet we make all kinds of excuses why we're not generous. If you're young, it's because, well, I don't have that much and I don't understand that, like, this is what the church needs because, the church, yada. And it's like, no. No, God owns everything. He does not need us. He desires our heart. So whether you have $10, $10,000, $10 million, $100 million, like if that's you, downtowncommunitychurch.com/give, okay? Just throwing that out there. We'll set up a meeting. But here's the thing. The reason why we don't is because there's uncertainty, because if I let go of that much of a percentage of my income, will there be enough? It is the uncertainty of trusting God that drives us back to the existential existence of slavery, as opposed to the freedom of trust and faith. Continues in all the congregation, chapter 17, verse 1. All the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of sin by stages according to the commandment of the Lord and camped at Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore, the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test God?" But the people thirsted there for water. And the people grumbled against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock?" I think they probably could have ended with children, right? Like that was enough. They're like, what else? Livestock, okay? With thirst. Like why did you do this? And here's what I also want you to hear. This is not me, and I talked about this a little bit last week. This is not me invalidating your fear, your concern, your hesitancy of the uncertainty. I mean, it's legitimate. They're looking at it and saying, "Moses, this army is about to kill us. Moses, we have nothing to eat. Moses, we don't have anything to drink. We are all about to die." In life, when it comes to the crossroads of our faithfulness to God, though we have been set free, we are not there in the promised land yet. We are not with God in heaven yet. Our salvation has been determined because we placed our faith, our hope, our trust in Jesus, and we are in the pathway towards walking to the not yet, the heavenly realms that we walk to, that we will be adopted as sons and daughters, justified by the blood of Jesus. We are walking towards that, and by the way, like the nation of Israel, they walked with the presence of God. They had the pillar of kind of smoke, the cloud. They had the pillar of fire to lead them by night. They were walking with the presence of God. Yet they came to crossroads where they had to decide, we will either trust or we will continue to long for slavery. We will either trust or we will continue to long for slavery. For some of us, it's a little bit more internal. For some of us, it's to choose to forgive someone who does not deserve your forgiveness. It's to choose to forgive someone who perhaps isn't even asked for your forgiveness. And that doesn't mean you walk back into the same situation and say, "I totally forgot about it. I'm going to be unaware and ignorant of all." No, of course. Be innocent as doves and shrewd as serpents is how Jesus put that. But you have somebody or some buddies in your life, and you long to live with the pain. And you don't really long to live with the pain, but you long to live in a way that your pain needs validation, that you have been hurt. And you have been hurt. But the reality is, that is not devoid of our ability to forgive. Because I have been forgiven. And there is no person on planet Earth who has done more to me, who has violated me more, who has gone against me more than I have against God. And that doesn't mean you haven't been hurt again. That doesn't mean you just walk back into the lion's den and say, "Here's an arm. You want to bite that one too?" Right? Like that's not it at all. But the reality is for some of us, it's just simply having the courage to forgive. To even walk down the pathway that says, "I'm not there yet." Because sometimes Christians, we're terrible about this. We're like, they hurt you like yesterday, like deeply, grievously hurt you yesterday. And we're like, on Thursday and on Friday, we're like, have you forgiven them yet? It's like, no. Like it's the process of engaging in the process of forgiveness. There's a coworker that you need to talk to about Jesus. And you guys know when I talk about talking about Jesus, it's not like, "Hey, here's what I believe. Let me tell you my testimony." People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Consequently, I am not going to lead with my thoughts and my beliefs. Personally, I find that wildly ineffective. I'm just simply going to ask you, what do you think? What do you think about God? What do you think about the Bible? You a churchgoer? You for it? You against it? Just simply having sacred conversations or spiritual conversations in secular environments. You have a coworker who's in need that you need to have a conversation with, an honest conversation. I don't know what it is for you. But here's my question. What's the area of life? What's the place of life? What's the one spot of life that you know God is calling you to step out in faith? God is calling you to step out into the realm of uncertainty and trust. I want you to hear Moses' response back in chapter 14 as they're coming on this Red Sea. And I think this one is just interesting because it's probably the most dire. Like, we don't know how long we're going to be able to survive without water. We don't know how long we'll be able to survive without food. But I can see Buddy's coming, and he's coming quickly. And so Moses, we need to figure out something, and we need to figure it out now. Verse 13. And Moses said to the people, fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. He says, I want you to stand firm. I want you to fear not. I want you to know that God is for you and that he's going to work for you today. For the Egyptians who you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent. He says, in other words, your active act is to trust. Your active act is to trust. That's why we hear that be silent, and it's like, oh. It's not exactly what he meant. He meant, I want you to not panic, because when uncertainty hits, when crisis hits, anxiety goes up, stress goes up, fear goes up. He says, hey, I want you to be silent. I want you to trust me. The way I conceptualize this, trying to take a ancient document in a text and put it in our modern context. This is like when I'm driving with the kids, and sometimes Ava, who's our 5-year-old, asks me, she's like, Dad, are we going the right way? Dad, are we going the right way? I'm like, be silent, Trust your father. And so the Lord said in verse 15 to Moses, this is what's funny. So Moses is like kind of, he's like, trust God, the salvation, all that stuff. And God says to Moses, why do you cry to me? Tell the people of Israel, go forward, lift up your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the people of Israel may go through the sea on dry ground. In other words, Moses, I just want you to take that next step of faith. Moses, I know this is crazy. I know that you're not going to get how it's going to work. And in fact, what Moses didn't know at this point is Moses stretches out his hand, puts it in the sea. And if you have read the Bible a lot, what you know to be true is that the sea parts and the people walk through. And as the people are walking through, they get to the other side. And as they walk past a certain point, all of a sudden the sea starts to close up and Pharaoh's army gets swallowed up. Moses doesn't know any of that's going to happen. He just says, Moses, I just want you to simply stretch out your hand. Stretch out your staff. Take that next step of faith and watch what I am going to do. And to be clear, sometimes God delivers you in a way that you would never expect, and he is glorified in it, like he did with the Red Sea. And sometimes, in our next step of faith, God does what he did with Jesus, which was to be hung on a cross. This does not promise our safety. This does not promise our health. This does not promise our wealth, but it does promise that God is faithful and that what he chooses is best as we take steps of faith to trust him. So if you choose to pursue a spouse who follows Jesus, does that mean you're going to be single for the rest of your life? I don't know. Be honest, there's not a ton of Christian dudes. I want there to be. I deeply want there to be. But I don't know. Let me tell you this. As someone who is so thankful for a wife who loves Jesus and who loves me and who loves our family, I can't imagine life any other way. I can't imagine life any other way. And some of you, the truth of your story is, that is what you chose, is the opposite way. For some of you, you're older in the crowd and you're 50, 60, 70, 90. If we have any 90s, I appreciate you being here. That music was loud, I'm so sorry, But the reality is you perhaps look back at your life and you're sitting there saying, I wish I would have chosen to trust a long time ago. And I don't care who you are. I don't care where you're from. I don't care what you do. We have the present to choose to trust. And I just would be remiss if I didn't reiterate the fact that our option is to choose the uncertainty of faith, the uncertainty of trusting God over the certainty of slavery. And oh, by the way, the big myth in that is that there's uncertainty with God, because God is in control the entire time. But I'm choosing to trust that what he knows is best, as opposed to the uncertainty of what I know. Even though it's enslavement, at least I know it. So what's the one area for you that God is calling you to choose to trust. Let's pray.